Art Forms and Society by Rene Huyghe from the LaRousse Encyclopedia of Renaissance and Baroque Art. The more one studies the 15th century in the northern countries, where the firmly established medieval spirit was making its last stand, the more agonised it appears. But once we turn to Italy, the perspective changes and shifts. Their civilization was very much older. Far from being founded in the Middle Ages, as was the northern civilization, it had been compromised and sometimes nearly destroyed by them. In Italy, regret for the lost splendours of antiquity brought a constant urge to revive them. Traces of the medieval spirit did, it is true, survive longer in the peninsula than might have been expected, since, in spite of some reserve, Italy too had been impregnated. Perhaps it was not extinguished until 1455, the year that Fra Angelico, in whom an intense religious spirituality persisted, and Pisanello, who embodied international Gothic and the court style, both died. And yet, by that time, the second half of the 15th century had already arrived, which is identified with the first Renaissance, and origins of which date back at least to the end of the 13th century, to Giotto. If one wished to show more succinctly how artificial are the traditional divisions of history, it would suffice to note the extent to which the 16th century, the century of Julius II and Leo X, which had been labelled the High Renaissance, spills over from the confines of this title. The first of the two popes died in 1513, the second in 1521, and it can be said that as early as 1527 the sack of Rome sounded the knell of this Renaissance, which was to be succeeded by a series of styles, from Mannerism to the Baroque, marking the stages of a totally different age. Italy and the role of form. Middle-class realism was the most immediate and natural form of expression in Flanders, where its first tentative appearance dates from the Gothic, and it remained the basis of Western art until the end of the 19th century. At best, the middle class, which continued under the aegis of the Church, as had previously the aristocracy, put this positive vision in the service of a piety which progressively declined in fervour, but which still maintained a high quality in the work of Van Eyck and Van der Weyden, until it grew insipid in that of Memling. Nothing remained but this reproduction of the appearance of reality, of complete truth, which still dominated the Dutch school in the 17th century. In Italy, also, the social scene was revolutionised by the triumph of the middle class. And yet the art arising out of the same growth of realism was completely different. A calm notation of visual reality never had a chance against the supremacy or even tyranny of the intellect, which required appearances to be sternly subjected to philosophical categories. From the beginning, Italian realism was a formal, not a visual realism. The great theorist of the 15th century, L.B. Alberti, inspired by Aristotle, observed of form and matter, "The one is a product of the mind, the other borrowed from nature." Moreover, it is to this reconquest of form which, with classical Greek thought, became the main phenomenon, that the first efforts of Italian art were directed after contact with the Gothic realistic trend. It differed from Byzantine art in this rediscovery of form and mass, and disengaged itself from Byzantine domination. The comparison in Chapter 1 of the research undertaken in different regions at the same moment had already shown that Italian realism had its own particular logic. Transported to a new milieu, thrust into a different situation, the upheaval which was transforming the Gothic was practically unrecognisable in Italy. But the principle of it remained the same. But in Byzantine-influenced Italy, to recover contact with reality meant above all to break away from the two-dimensional interpretation and the immaterialism of Christian art of the previous centuries. It meant reintroducing the concrete reality of things through mass and form. This was the meaning of the antique heritage which, buried under a thin layer of foreign importations, aspired to impose itself everywhere in Italy, and it now becomes important to view the art of the peninsula through the perspective of tradition and autochthonous evolution, rather than through the Middle Ages. With Cavallini, drawing was already taking account of relief in order to restore to painting the illusion of full, solid mass. When the realist impulse showed itself precociously in Italy, artists borrowed the abandoned methods of antiquity and reanimated them. They were much more interested in reproducing structure and relief than concrete substance. Stone, flesh, wood, or material, which preoccupied the northern middle-class artists whose art was guided by no previous culture. At the end of the 13th century, Cimabue in Florence and Cavallini in Rome, striving for faithful representation, turned towards sculptural art. That's why the initial impetus came from the sculptors, the ones who in the 13th century worked for Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, basing their style on antiquity, and the ones who, in Pisa, beginning with Nicola Pisano, founded the new school, by adding to the Roman style that of the French Gothic. This introductory role played by sculpture already shows that the Italian inspiration was going to be, above all, and in the true sense of the word, sculptural. When Giotto, through his genius, brought the research that had been inaugurated to fruition, he created a sculptural style of painting. It was settling of an old account between East and West. Ghiberti realised this when, at the beginning of the 15th century, he said in homage to Giotto that he discovered a whole doctrine which had been buried for 600 years. So much light is thereby thrown on the history of art that we must pause for a moment to consider it. Linear art and three-dimensional art. There are indeed two fundamental possibilities for art, which coexisted from prehistoric times until after the emergence of Greece, as distinct from the Oriental world, when they separated and opposed one another. One respects the flat surface and its two dimensions. The other represents mass and attempts to give a true representation of real form in its three dimensions. The first demands the use of drawing in its linear form, transforming everything into a linear design. The most frequent result is to produce flat surfaces suitable for colour. The second, by means of the illusion of trompe-l'oeil in painting, expresses itself as volume, the drawing of which is confined to defining the contours. Whereas Egypt had cultivated not only the flat surface in her paintings or bas-reliefs, which were sometimes combined, but also the high relief in her statues, which were conceived as doubles, and Mesopotamia, like Crete, had shown a marked preference for the first form of expression. Greece and then Rome were preeminent in the second form of art. Their painting was, by definition, the art of the flat surface, attempted by means of shading and modelling, which rounded the surface to infringe the two-dimensional rule and create the illusion of a third dimension, and therefore of relief and depth. It must already be apparent that where the line predominates, it suggests a dynamism by the vivacity of its drawing, or provides a representation of movement. Volume, on the other hand, only exists in relation to a static centre, that of its mass. It evokes an effective ponderance and balance. It immobilizes. While in Greek vase painting, which retained its linear formula, contrasted with ancient statuary or mural painting in its use of scenes of movement, sculpture, apart from the ambitious attempts of Myron and the final excesses of the Hellenistic phase, found its ideal in balanced, harmonious stability. In all Western art it was discovered that statuary only becomes animated if it tends to go beyond its own limitations, that is, in its Mannerist and Baroque periods. Drawing at times seems to strive for free dynamic expansion, ignoring all formal restraint and allowing itself to be carried away by its own possibilities. Barbarian decoration and, taken to the extreme, Irish miniatures are examples of this. Generally it confines itself to animated play of lines. It tends towards calligraphy. It becomes arabesque. This was the solution of the Gothic miniature, this tendency to yield to the impulse of the hand, to the ease of gesture, flourishes in the sculptor's and goldsmith's craft. When the draftsman is not confronted by the necessity of rendering volume, he gives full play to linear rhythm. For example, Rubens overcomes the discipline of classical form in order to allow the enthusiasm of his creative gesture to live in his style, in the form of undulations. Rembrandt, still more independent, makes his canvas vibrate with sparkling brushstrokes. On the other hand, while line, in its vital continuity, spontaneously depended on rhythm, high relief, establishing fixed relationships between elements which could be isolated and were only constructed together, called for proportion, the only means of binding them together intimately. This can be demonstrated in the art of classical antiquity, and it will again be demonstrated in Italian art. Finally, when line, in painting for example, is used to create the illusion of volume, it is of necessity restricted to the outline, and must suppress its potential dynamism in order to concentrate on the form it encloses. It soon has to revert to geometric figures which define form, in order to define the mass for which it is responsible. Drawing must become static and loses its natural flexibility. It ceases to be gesture and becomes form. It becomes petrified. This is the law which regulates classical art, from the Italians to Jacques-Louis David. Mediterranean art from the days of ancient Greece was three-dimensional. Persian art, on the other hand, was two-dimensional. From antiquity, therefore, an antithesis was established, which was continued through the centuries with mass predominating in the west and the two-dimensional plane in the east. The antique capital carved in the round lived on in Byzantine art, carved in the flat with the ornament sketchily outlined. The drill producing pierced decoration replaced the chisel which models. Byzantium de-westernized the classical heritage and shifted towards the east. As soon as ancient tradition declined, art favoured a flat surface design, and Byzantine mosaics assured its success. The moment this tradition revived, three-dimensional art reasserted itself. Once Italian art had reverted to its sources, its main objective was to represent form in three-dimensional space. The technique of fresco painting, which requires even, matte colours and simple, firm contours due to the fact that some of the lines have to determine the area that must be finished before the plaster dries, could only encourage an arrangement in broad masses. Giotto used this to reintroduce three-dimensional form into Italian art, the tradition of which had been submerged beneath the double offensive of the barbarians and Byzantium. This was Italy's true vocation. If Gothic sculpture had helped to establish it anew, Gothic painting, on the other hand, was going to endanger this reconquest. Illumination and stained glass did indeed oppose it, for they express everything in flat colours, the outlines of which are drawn by the illuminator with arabesque-like flexibility. This style had been diffused by the Parisian studios from the end of the 13th century by Master Honoré, and by the 14th century by Jean Puchel. Italian art and the arabesque. Thus the Italian school, in its progress towards the Renaissance, found itself faced with two possibilities, and hesitated. Giotto had committed it forcefully to the path of the first, and his example had great influence. In 1339, 2 years after Giotto died, the leading master of the Sienese school, Simone Martini, established himself in Avignon, where he spent the rest of his life. His native town had maintained continuous commercial and financial relations with the papal city from the time of Benedict XII. As early as the end of the 13th century, Duccio, though he retained the Sienese adaptation of Byzantine flatness, modified its linear rigidity by simple, elegant drawing, the example for which had perhaps been provided by French miniatures. Siena was prepared to welcome the French pictorial style, dominated by the miniature. Simone had already come in contact with it at the time of his stay in Naples and at the court of the princes of Anjou, whose kingdom occupied the whole of the southern half of Italy and thus constituted a centre for the spread of the French style. This was further assured by books containing illuminations whose influence, already so noticeable in Siena, was profound in Bologna, where the university prompted a great output of manuscripts. As a result, the Gothic style was disseminated again by the Bolognese illuminators who derived their inspiration from it. It maintained its position consistently in this way, in the face of Tuscan influence depending on the enormous prestige of Giotto. It was in the middle of the 14th century, in the work of Lorenzetti, for example, the two influences are intermingled, and a balance was sought in which volume and arabesque would be equally satisfied. In northern Italy, the work of Lombardy, deriving from the miniaturist tradition, which could be called Franco-Bolognese, maintained with greater integrity the Gothic style in its drawing, the importance of which, at the end of the 14th century, is demonstrated by the art of Giovannino de Grassi. It was soon to find support in the social evolution. Indeed, the social situation in Italy, as in Flanders, evolved towards a triumph of the middle class, but Italy profited from a certain initial advantage. The patriciate, which in the Low Countries had confined itself to forming a new ruling class, here went a stage further, or a prince who was often a military chief, a condottieri. The first of these lords, the Scaliger in Verona and the Visconti in Milan, the exact centre of Lombardy, established themselves in the 13th century. Only Venice remained fiercely hostile to this evolution and clung to the same patrician stage as that in Flanders. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why her artists preferred sensuous realism rather than too much intellectual elaboration, as did the northern artists. On the other hand, the princes, whether they were of noble birth or were newcomers like the Medici, the bankers of Florence, had more aristocratic aims. They soon formed around themselves real courts, which either from inclination or in order to strengthen themselves were intended to revive the medieval courts. Thus, as had been seen in Chapter 1, a chain stretched across Europe, linking the last centres of a dying society. It ran from London, so imbued with French culture, to Prague, where the Luxembourgs were reigning. Moreover, the daughter of the Emperor Charles IV of Bohemia married Richard II of England in 1383. The father of Charles IV, John of Luxembourg, and John II the Good of France had both throughout their lives felt a longing for the golden age of chivalry. They were symbols of a past world. The former was killed at Crécy in 1346, while the latter was taken prisoner at Poitiers in 1356. To begin with, the 15th century appears to sound the knell for the centres of Gothic culture. The French court seemed the worst hit. Driven from Paris, which was a terrible blow by the defeat at Agincourt in 1415, the court vegetated in Bourges. But, to tell the truth, it had already been divided up for half a century between Bourges itself, which the Duke of Berry, son of John the Good, and nephew of Charles IV of Bohemia, had already made his capital. Dijon, whence the power of the Dukes of Burgundy erupted, Moulins, the Loire, Anjou and Provence, which had become the centres of the French artistic schools, and Avignon, from which the Pope had withdrawn the court of 1378, but where he had left a legate. There the old medieval traditions shed their last radiance, but they came to terms with the new trends, and eventually with the visual realism of the Flemish bourgeois. As for the Italian courts, although they evolved out of the new world then being formed, they were intended to follow in the footsteps of the medieval aristocracy, to equal it in luxury and brilliance, so court art had to be made more vigorous. The international Gothic grew out of this combination and, as we have seen in Chapter 1, spread from London to Prague, a courtly vision evolving under the pressure of the realist trend. Some of its centres were in Italy where, especially in the north, It helped to sustain the fashion for the linear style, hostile to volume and spatial recession. Milan, under the aegis of the Visconti, with the combination of Lombard illuminators trained by French examples, and the re-establishment of a life of aristocratic luxury, represented an almost opposite pole to Florence. Work on the cathedral, attracting many different artists, contributed to the expansion of the style, which found in Verona, the seat of the Scaliger, another stronghold. It spread to the Marsh, where it was represented by Gentile de Fabriano, through whom it reached Florence. Under Gentile's influence, and that of Stefano de Zevio of Verona, Pisanello carried it to Rome with great brilliance, to Venice, and from court to court, to the Visconti, the Gonzaga, the Este, the Malatesta and Aragona, until the middle of the 15th century. In the same generation, the Sienese tradition of Dom Lorenzo Monaco, who was as much a miniaturist as a painter, was already passed on to Florence through the art of his pupil, Fra Angelico. Moreover, the tradition of the arabesque spreading over a flat surface found some support in the capital of Tuscany among the goldsmith carvers, and the effects of it can be traced as far as the second half of the 15th century in the sculpture of Agostino de Diccio and the painting of Baldo Venetti, Botticelli and Filippino Lippi. But it then became absorbed in the opposing three-dimensional form. The re-establishment of form. At the beginning of the century, there was to be found in Florence a second Giotto who, in spite of his short life, 1401 to 1428, re-established the sculptural style. This was Masaccio. With him, realism expressed itself again through the feeling for mass, suggested by space in three dimensions. It was helped by the impetus given at that time to sculpture by the stonemasons of the cathedral under the direction of Ghiberti. The competition of 1401 for the second doors of the baptistry had sparked it off. Masaccio had the good fortune to be the contemporary of Donatello, his elder by 15 years, and also of Leone Battista Alberti, born in 1404, who, with his complete clarity of thought, was establishing the doctrinaire framework which would confirm definitively the return of the classical Mediterranean heritage. The Gothic deviation was over. Apart from a few survivals, Florence once again asserted itself as the centre of the revival. Italian art, however, was to be exposed to another temptation coming from the north. The subject this time was of the latest research, that of blending the representation of reality with that of matter. The commercial links between the cloth-trading cities of Italy and Flanders was more active than ever, and were doubled by the network of banks maintained mostly by the Italians. The influx of northern artists is a measure of the knowledge of, and the interest in their art and the high esteem in which it was held. The connection between the Arnolfini and Van Eyck in Bruges is well known, and so is that of the Portinari and the Vandigos in Florence, and the visits of Van der Weyden and Fouquet. The introduction of oil painting into Italy, attributed to Antonello de Messina, demanded quite different studies for panel painting from those needed for fresco. They would be especially valued in northern Italy, from Venice to Mantua, where the links with the northern countries, Germany and Flanders, were the most direct. But a remarkable phenomenon took place in Venice, Mantua, Padua, Verona and Ferrara, for the most part under the impetus of Mantegna's genius. In the second half of the 15th century, oil painting was used to imitate the sharpest metal and the hardest and most compact stone, and to give a sort of excess of definition which confers a transient and in some respects exaggerated appearance of form. A hard world of steel and flint eliminates everything whose softness or fluidity might weaken the dominance of forms. It is curious to see that this contamination is reciprocal. While towards the middle of the 15th century Italy is exposed to the temptation of a material style, northern painting, which had brought it to Italy, seems for its part to be suddenly obsessed by the sculptural style, that is, by the suggestion of more isolation and relief of bodies in space. This suggestion is more or less implied in the whole search for realism, hence the trompe l'oeil. The Flemish artists were aware of it, and the grisaille figures, which they often painted on the reverse sides of polyptychs, were imitations of statues. The combination of sculpture and painting on altarpieces must have been contributed to. The combination of sculpture and painting on the altarpieces must have contributed to this substitution. The close connection between Rogier, van der Weyden, and the sculptors of Tournai has already been emphasised. But towards the middle of the century, the Italian example exercised, in its turn, a strong influence on the northern artists. By abandoning the uninterrupted contours, lessening contrasts, and eliminating half-tones, the illusion was created of a body cut in stone or wood. The prestige of Klaus Sluter and the school of Burgundy must have counted for a lot in this new trend. It was revived in the German schools, where it swept away the remnants of the Parisian arabesque, and founders about the second third of the century were Mulcher, who was a sculptor and perhaps a painter, and Conrad Wietz, whose father had actually worked at the court of Burgundy. It triumphed after 1450 with Michael Pasha, who was obsessed with volume and space, and passed to the school of Avignon, where the Pieta seems to have been carved from hard wood, and perhaps the influence of Wietz was in some way responsible. It was to be found again in Spain with Jaime Huyghe, Bartolome Bermeo, and Fernando Gallegos, and in Portugal with Nuno Gonçalves. In Flanders, it was Van der Goes who was most sensitive to it, and in France, Jean Fouquet, who, less harsh, preferred smooth, solid roundness to sharp, brittle, flat drawing. It was the time when Andrea del Castagno was producing in Italy what were really adaptations of Donatello, though actually in fresco, his imitation statues perched in imitation niches in Sta Apollonia in Florence. It is perhaps the admirable frescoes of the Schifanoia Palace in Ferrara by Tura, Cossa and Ercole de Roberti working in association that we find the most complex picture of the art of that time torn between these different influences. The intensity of execution is as violent in the relief of the forms as in the substance of the material. But this realism, at once asserted and modified, is used to depict the old courtly themes of noble life with which the new learned humanism is mingled. The intellectuals and aesthetic theory. The fact is that a new class, the intellectuals, which had begun to form ever since the development of a middle class between the peasants and the aristocracy, reached maturity with the Renaissance. This was to have a great effect on the evolution of culture, and intellectuals were, at that time, above all, humanists. Henceforth, the inevitable parallel between philosophy and art, often unconscious until then, was to be strengthened by the lucid intellectual thought which the craftsman brought to his task. He was no longer an executant, a craftsman, but a responsible person conscious of his mission. Alberti stated this. The precepts he formulated are drawn directly from philosophy and appropriate to the regulating and defining of the means and method of art. They no longer have anything in common with the studio recipes taken from the ancient treatises, from the monk Theophilus to Canino Canini. The roots of the new intellectualism go back a long way. At the end of the 11th century, St. Anselm had written of faith in search of reason, Fides quaerens intellectum. At the beginning of the 13th century, the popes themselves helped the universities to free themselves from the authority of the bishops. Certain others, especially those of northern Italy, where law was taught, and the most ancient, Bologna founded in 1158 and Padua in 1228, even threw off the control of the pope. The rise of the bourgeois had added the legislative spirit of the jurist to the positive spirit of the businessman. The pursuit of logic and argument succeeded the quest for the contemporary ideal, and the ideals of chivalry. No doubt this evolution counted for a great deal in the development of scholasticism at the heart of religious thought, and in the increasingly important position of lawyers at the courts of sovereigns such as Philip the Fair, and in social life. Man learns to reason for himself, to propose problems and resolve them. Once art no longer has a solely religious function and tends to isolate itself like philosophy, to think for itself, the time is ripe for research into the rules of beauty. Alberti, the great theorist of the Renaissance, belonged to the famous family of wool merchants and bankers. One of his ancestors was described at his death as the richest man in terms of money in the last 200 years, and had studied law and then mathematics at Bologna. If we add that among his fellow students was Francesco Filelfo, who had returned from Constantinople, then we'll have all the elements to explain the aesthetics of the Renaissance. The mind formed by the study of law and mathematics was employed in the exalted resurrection of ancient philosophy, preserved by the Greeks of Byzantium. Greek immigration was increasing with the Turkish threat to the old capital of the empire, soon besieged, captured, and devastated by Muhammad II in 1453. The influence of Constantinople had begun well before the final act. In the middle of the 14th century, the philosopher Barlaam had accepted a mission to the west and had been in contact with Petrarch. He was followed by Leonezio Pilato. The exchanges had been favoured by the negotiations for obtaining the help of the West, and also for reconciliating the two churches. Emperor Manuel II Komnenos had begun in Europe in 1399 a series of démarches, which led him as far as Paris and London. He was not to return permanently until 1404. A few years later he sent the famous humanist Manuel Chrysoloras on a mission to Italy. His grandson, John VIII, in his turn, made the journey in 1437 and stayed in Florence for the council. He was accompanied by, among others, the illustrious Cardinal Bizarion. A medal by Pisanello and the fresco of the Procession of the Magi by Benozzo Gozzoli perpetuated the memory of the emperor. Just as the Paleologues had restored a great final brilliance to Byzantine culture, these journeys and exchanges brought a considerable impetus to the revival of classical antiquity. It was not only the philosophers, some of whom were masters of great repute, who came, but the original Greek texts became known. As Poggio had done in Italy, Guarino, a disciple of Chrysoloras, collected manuscripts alone in Greece, 238 of them, it is said, and brought them back from his journey. Spurred on in this way, Italian philosophers eagerly resumed contact with the literature and philosophy of antiquity, drawing on the genuine sources. At the same time, following the example of this old Byzantine civilization, the position of the intellectual became established and assumed very much greater importance. Thus, the opposing traditions of Plato and Aristotle were given new life, but in more authentic form. The philosophy of Aristotle had acquired, during the last centuries of the Middle Ages, a considerable following. Under the influence especially of the nominalists, it had advocated increasing preoccupation with positive reality, which should be approached henceforth with the only human weapons, the senses to observe it, and the reason to understand it. This philosophy was solidly established in the University of Padua, which the patronage of Venice had freed in 1405 from the control of the Church. This Aristotelian philosophy, which was brought from the University of Paris by Pietro d'Albano at the beginning of the 14th century, and which 2 centuries later, with Pomponazzi, dared to deny the immortality of the soul, was involved in the scientific trend because of its close attachment to the Averroism of the 13th century. But the nominalism of Paris and Occam had also penetrated into Italy. Freed from the out-of-date dynamism of Aristotle, it had opened up the way for modern mechanics by admitting that motion would be perpetual if it were not braked by friction. From this arose in part the philosophy of Leonardo da Vinci, who owed much to Albert of Saxony and Nicolas Oresme. But Leonardo was also influenced by the technological spirit of Archimedes, who, in ancient times, had indicated the way in which modern science was to take. For Leonardo, art was inseparable from science and philosophy. He showed how to observe phenomena by training the perception, and he called upon reason to deduce their laws, and thus to discover the secrets of nature. See in order to know, but know in order to have power. This is the link which unites the artist and the man of science. Even when it adapted itself to this experimental discipline, the Italian genius did not abandon its intellectualism. While the northern painter, committed to the same path, was content to perceive appearances as faithfully and precisely as possible, the Italian painter did not stop until he had defined the laws which explain and control them. Whereas the Flemish artist confined himself to reproducing depth by the most subtle optical notations of the atmosphere, the substance of space, the Italian aimed to push on to a complete, intelligible and rational doctrine of depth, basing it on mathematics and geometry. This is perspective, which provides the means to reproduce reality by means of pure theory. That is the aspect which reality ought to have. The whole of the 15th century in Italy was to be absorbed in this enthusiastic study. El Venturi had stated it excellently. After substituting nature for God as the goal of art, that is the stage where the northern artist stopped, human intelligence is substituted for God as the origin of art. The Neoplatonic reaction against positivism. God and reason had been separated, and now reason could do without him. But medieval fervour was still so close that serious doubts were unavoidable. For many Christian consciences, this break was a catastrophe. It led to Savonarola's violent counterattack on intelligence in its battle with faith, which dragged art, with its independence and paganism, into disrepute. It shattered Michelangelo, whose poems reflect the thirst to find God again. The opposing doctrine of the Neoplatonists, on the other hand, permitted the avoidance of naturalism, the gratification of this nostalgia for the divine, the reconciliation of the pagan lesson of pure beauty with religious scruples, since beauty was a means of approaching God. In the 14th century, the Rhenish mystics, who revived what remained of Neoplatonism in religion, in religious thought, had already made use of their enthusiasm over and above the senses and reason to oppose the triumphant doctrine of Occam. The 15th century of Italy was to find a more direct contact with the restored Platonic philosophy. It was an illustrious cardinal, Nicholas Cusanus, born near Trier in 1401, thus in the same Rhenish area, who was to commit the 15th century in this direction. In spite of his Occamist training acquired in Heidelberg, he soon became an adherent of Neoplatonism. He wanted to renounce the down-to-earth doctrine of positivism. He opposed it by a doctrine that transcended the normal apprehension of reality. Over and above knowledge through reason and the senses, it was necessary to reach knowledge through the intellect, whereby endless multiplicity of the particular is superseded by the revelation of its unity. This is God. It is also beauty. His Italian contemporary, Leone Battista Alberti, who made famous the unrestrained desire to contemplate infinite beauty, was to apply this doctrine to art. The doctrine did indeed establish the ideal and almost mystic character of beauty, its power and duty to confer unity on initial diversity by means of harmony. For 400 years, European art hardly ever swerved from this conviction, which had become fundamental. Neoplatonism in Germany belonged particularly to conventual and therefore popular circles. They reacted against the intellectualism of the universities, and therefore they had very little contact with art. In Italy, the opposite took place. Her success was assured by the intellectuals, the humanists who were dissatisfied with 14th century positivism, and, under the impact of genuine antique philosophy, perceived how Platonism and its resulting doctrines justified the ancient masterpieces which they admired, at the same time permitted an escape from the dead end of materialism. Moreover, in Italy, the humanists did not live in close proximity, as they did in university circles. Thanks to their patrons, they formed part of the aristocratic society and shared their taste for lavishness and refinement. Beauty, considered as a means of rising above everyday reality, brought the desired scale of values, all the more so since at the same time it allowed richness and luxury to expand. So, in the struggle which was taking place between the Aristotelian and Platonic philosophies, it was the second doctrine that gained the victory, so completely in fact that it became a keystone of the Renaissance. In the middle of the 15th century, the philosophy of Aristotle, which extended and renewed the trend of the preceding century, was spread with great brilliance in Florence by Donato Acciajuoli and by John Argyropoulos, who came from Byzantium. Cosimo de' Medici was the first to patronize it. Platonism, however, which was taught by Manuel Chrysoloras, had from the outset found a great following, to such an extent that Petrarch had championed it against Aristotelianism. The master of Chrysoloras, Gemistus Pletho, one of the greatest philosophers of dying Byzantium, came to Ferrara in Florence in 1438, during the council, and gave a definitive impetus in favour of Plato, of whom he was a devoted follower. In a vigorous attack on Gennadius, and later on George of Trebizond, he published in 1440 a pamphlet against Aristotle. But it was his disciple, Cardinal Bessarion, who, while respecting Aristotle, assured the final victory in his In Calumniatorum Platonis. In 1456, Cosimo took Marsilio Ficino into his household, where he became the teacher and friend of Lorenzo de' Medici, while in 1471 Argyropoulos gave up his position and retired. Ficino founded his Platonic Academy, gathering together patrons such as Federigo de Montefeltro, whose court at Urbino was to have so much influence on the destiny of the Renaissance, and humanists like Pico della Mirandola and Landino in the common cult of Platonism. He translated Plato in 1484 and Plotinus in 1492. The Academy spread this cult throughout Europe because of its contacts with the great minds of the period. The new doctrine, in fact, not only dominated Italy, but in Germany captivated Dürer, who came to study in Italy and was in turn the author of several theoretical treatises. In Flanders, it influenced Erasmus, whose In Praise of Folly, published in Paris in 1511, was to have enormous repercussions. In it he states that truth cannot be reached through matter, which is concerned with the body and makes the soul blind. At the same time, the shifting of the economic influence from Bruges to Antwerp made the break with the past easy, and started a new preoccupation with beauty, often clumsy, of which the chief exponent was Quentin Metzys. The King of France, Francois I, reacted against Louis XI's drift towards the middle class, and took as models the Italian patron princes. He reinstated the aristocratic aesthetics at his court, introducing the Collège de France in opposition to the Aristotelianism of the Sorbonne. He directed national art towards the ideal of beauty by inaugurating the school of Fontainebleau. The moment this Rome of the North became a real centre of the Renaissance, the northern countries were won over. The apotheosis of beauty. The Middle Ages were definitely over. From now on, Italy led a new research. She quite naturally sought beauty and form, according to her sculptural tradition, never completely interrupted since antique times, and in the human form since henceforth the object of action no longer lay in God alone. As in medieval thought, but increasingly in man himself, intoxicated with his ever-widening powers. Just as in the civilization of classical antiquity, man took his place in the centre of creation. It appeared intelligible to him, made to suit him, amenable to his wishes. He was impatient to exercise and extend the boundless power of his philosophy on things. Francis Bacon was soon to sum up the ambitions which science in particular would develop in the centuries to come. The search for the very power of human genius and its role over the universality of things, so as to establish this reign of man over creatures. A little later, Descartes too proclaimed the ambition of our species to become the master and possessor of nature. Art is one of the means to this mastery. It captures appearances, but more than that, it adapts them to our system of thought, which is a revival and extension of the classical dream. Vitruvius, who was to become an indispensable authority, extolled eurythmia, the repetition of parts, and symmetria, putting them in proportion. This regulating spirit, eminently architectural, communicated itself to painting, in which composition played a principal part. Alberti was preoccupied with the organisation of both the whole and the parts, as well as their interrelationship, in order to attain an immediately perceptible unity, a unity of such importance that it conferred preeminence henceforth on the circle, the most centralised of all geometric forms. Humanism is inseparable from the scientific impetus on which its philosophy is based, so geometry and mathematics were called upon, as they were in Greece, to help in defining this ideal beauty of form. Marsilio Ficino stressed how necessary mathematics are to the art. Plato would have agreed with him. It was from him and his theory of the 5 perfect Platonic solids that the revelation of the eternal secret was sought. Piero della Francesco was the most famous researcher in this field and inspired the De Divina Proportione by Fra Luca de Pacioli, in which, as we saw in chapter 1, this almost magic but calculable formula for beauty was perceived in a perfect proportion called the golden section. The passionate interest brought to the problem by the painters as Leonardo and Dürer, whose Melancholia meditates upon scattered instruments of measurement and geometry, is well known. The same scientific spirit, obsessed with rule and compasses, was applied to the more practical questions of perspective, the solution to which was ecstatically sought by Paolo Uccello. His exclamation has remained famous, "Oh, che dolce cosa è questa prospettiva." What a lovely thing this perspective is. A painting becomes a problem to solve. In someone like Leonardo, who possessed this experimental spirit, it can be seen how he becomes increasingly absorbed in the search for the ideal of beauty. But it was without doubt Raphael who was to provide a complete, sometimes sublime expression of the perfect union between the religious spirit and the profane, in the heart for the search of God half perceived in the transcendence of beauty. Beauty is sought for in a unity achieved in form by proportion, and in the work as a whole by composition. Composition is a resultant of geometry and rhythm added to convergent perspective, which contributes also to the realism of space. With Raphael, the spirit of the Renaissance is triumphant. It took root in Rome and in the heart of Christianity. It enjoyed the patronage of the popes. It dominated the different arts, architecture, sculpture and painting, so related by the unity of their principles that the greatest geniuses, from Leonardo to Michelangelo, could practice them all in turn. In the Renaissance, humanity lived through one of these highest periods of balance and fullness, which seem at the time so securely established that they are considered permanent. This balance is born of the perfect equation of what is seen and understood of the world, and the means which are used to represent and translate it. It seemed that all problems were solved, or were about to be solved. However, a shrewd observer would have already noticed the first beginnings of a movement which was going to undermine this certainty. A new set of doubts was to ensure the development of new forms of expression. The eternal adventure of art would continue on its course.